Right, good morning. It's past, I will start. I'd like to welcome you to my presentation. I'm going to been asked to kind of reflect on designing an inclusive future, and so to introduce myself, I want to just really start with the basis for my presentation today, which is the Construction Industry Council's Roadmap for Change, which sets out this vision of delivering an inclusive and attractive built environment that represents the communities that we serve. And I think it's for me, a very critical vision. And I'll lead you through a bit of personal history. I've got to introduce myself in three different points to explain what leads me to want to talk about that statement. So part one of the introduction, from you see job title, I am the inclusive design lead at HS2. HS2 obviously is the largest infrastructure project currently in Europe, and I think what's critical about this is the lives that HS2 will touch. It overall is going to touch about 25 stations, half the UK population, and so within that, people have to be at the heart of that design. So inclusive design, designing for an inclusive future, is critical for that. But the starting point for me, really, in terms of where possibly this conversation started, I've been involved in inclusive design for over 20 years now, and was very privileged to have been involved in 2012, which is obviously quite a long time ago. I think even longer than you may think. So this is a family photo. This is my son. He's hanging out with the Australian handball wheelchair team. We were watching the Australian wheelchair basketball team in the wheelchair basketball arena in the Olympic Park. It was an amazing time to have my son surrounded by so many role models in a venue that I'd helped design and set the parameters for. But actually, the work for the Olympics started back in 2000 for me anyway. Started back in 2005. When we created the Access for All framework, and it was an interesting time within London. Within the UK, we obviously got legislation in place, but I think we had also got a new mayor of London for the first time, setting up new policies, and there was a draft policy around inclusive design. And this policy started to adopt what a definition that had been around since the early 2000s, developed by Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, CABE. They had a definition of inclusive design. So inclusive design is what? It's inclusive, it's responsive to people's needs, it's flexible in terms of people using the design in different ways. It's convenient in terms of effort, but I think the important bit that I want to dwell on, the bit that's I've emboldened on the slide, is that it's accommodating for all people, regardless of age, gender, mobility, ethnicity, and circumstance. Then also talks about welcoming, not providing disabling barriers. I'm being realistic in terms of it's actually, it's a pragmatic solution. It's not about going over top. It's actually just good design. But I think the accommodating for all people, regardless of age, gender, mobility, ethnicity, and circumstance, and the GLA and the definition that went into the framework talked about social circumstance. And I think the social circumstance is also an important one. And I'll come back to that. But I think affordability is part of that equation. When we were developing this framework, really, I think we were at a point where we had a British standard. That British standard talks about designing for disabled people. We had a building regulation that talked about access for. Had just actually really just changed. It had moved from being access for disabled people to access for people. Building regulations were starting to try and be inclusive, but all the provisions within it was really based around the needs of disabled people. And there was a lot of talk about designing for the disabled as being a homogenous group of people. It was a language almost of them and us as well. And we wanted to change that. And actually there was a word that I didn't understand or wasn't in my vocabulary then, but I think very much so is now. It's intersectionality, and trying to understand intersectionality. There were no design codes about how you design for people regardless of age, gender, mobility, ethnicity, or circumstance. No, that didn't exist. And one of the outcomes that were published of this thinking led through, helped inform the master plan, but led through to, in 2008, the ODA published their inclusive design standards, which I was involved in writing. And it's within these standards we looked to try and address that concept of inclusive design. So it was very much based on specifics of buildings, but within it started to try and look at family provision, to consider age, look at faith requirements and the implications to that in terms of elements such as privacy and prayer within the code. And the purpose of these design standards for the Olympic Delivery Authority was that they would get a consistent approach to inclusive design across all the different design teams they were using. And I think for many people, this was the first time, and especially for a major project, that kind of notion of the intersectionality had been codified. It was in a design code. And I was very pleased also to be involved in the other publication that's showing on the screen, which is the 2019 Inclusive Design Standards, which are for the Legacy Development Corporation, the corporation that was formed to deliver the Olympic legacy. They took on the mantle of inclusive design, one of our Paralympic goals, and look to address that in the new neighbourhood of London it was creating. And in 2019, there was an exercise to kind of reflect on the last 7 or 8 years of development that had occurred and how that had been integrated into that part of London. And we took a step back. And one of the things that we looked at, so probably fill in the gap there, after the games, the ODA adopted, the LLDC adopted the ODA standards and updated them and included elements around housing as well, and looked at faith and cultural requirements within housing and integrated those. So when we updated the inclusive design standards in 2019, they were further they were included, but what we also wanted to look at was not just the building elements. We took it back from looking at the neighbourhood level and thinking about inclusive neighbourhoods rather than the just the detail of the buildings itself, and setting it back from and again looking at factors such as things like inclusive play, not just inclusive play from a child perspective, but I think inclusive play from an all age perspective. Looking at the multi-generational as well as how we support older Londoners, and also the faith and cultural considerations that we need to build into our thinking when designing. But one of the things that I think I always come up with this discussion, but isn't it that we talk about, we have to comply with the Equality Act, and for those participants who are not from the UK, before the Equality Act, which came to 2010, we had the various different pieces of civil rights legislation, one of them being the Disability Discrimination Act. And the Disability Discrimination Act was in place since 1995, and it talked about making adjustments to the built environment. So we started to have this language around complying with the buildings, complying with the DDA, but they don't. The DDA is about giving rights to individual, in the same way the Equality Act is about giving rights to the individual, and it's a legal framework to protect the rights and advance the quality of opportunity. So in the Equality Act, it covers 9 different protected characteristics: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. They're all different protected characteristics lumped into one act. And the basic premise is you will not discriminate against people because of their protected characteristic. I think the interesting thing when we apply that to it's then how do we apply that to the built environment? And in terms of the Act only references adjustments to the built environment in regard to disability. And there's a recognition within the law that the built environment is disabling, and therefore there is a need to make physical adjustments to the environment. There is a need to make provision of auxiliary aids, such as equipment or interpretation in terms of things like British Sign Language, but it doesn't then follow through. That same reasonable adjustments duty doesn't follow through to other protected characteristics. But actually, the built environment is disabling for many people, whether they have a disability or not. So I think just saying the Act, the Equality Act, puts in place provisions to make sure that our environment is inclusive. We then have our building regulations. Again, building regulations set out various criteria for a minimum standard, but they don't necessarily mean that we have an inclusive environment. They may mean we have an accessible environment that people with sight or mobility impairment may be able to use, but they don't necessarily address further considerations. And as I said, the Act is not a design code, it is civil legislation. So the built environment can't comply with the Act. It's those who will operate within the built environment have to comply with the Act. So it's a building, until it's actually in operation, the Act doesn't really apply. I think from a public sector point of view, there is a public sector duty to promote equality of opportunity between different protected characteristics. And that's, I think, where we start to think about, well, actually, it needs to inform our strategic thinking. It needs to inform our policies. So from a HS2 perspective, we have an inclusive design policy that informs our processes, it informs our strategy, design strategy, it informs our technical criteria. But it's a policy that the high level ownership of that's important. And I think that's one of the things that we did really learn from 2012. I think 2012 for me was the first time really we started to codify right at the beginning, right at the strategic level for a major project, built intervention into the built environment, how inclusive design would be there. So what the framework and then ODA's, the Olympic Delivery Authority's inclusive design strategy set out right at the beginning how it was from a strategic brief. It then set the technical requirements that had to be met. It set a conformance reporting process, so there was a level of transparency to be able to identify how those criteria were being met, and it became contractual. You weren't going, and the Legacy Development Corporation followed that through. You will not get your building stages signed off, your scheme design signed off, your detailed design signed off, your handover certificate signed off, unless it's demonstrated that the inclusive design criteria had been met within those standards. And what I think is important for me now in terms of where we are at is we finally, 2 years ago now, we got a new British standard. It is a revision, BS 300, which was the original basis for many people's thinking. It was a British standard that came out in 2001, which was design of the built environment for disabled people. In 2018, two significant things changed with that for me. The first one was we changed the title. A very simple thing, but the message it gives is important because it talks about delivering the design of an inclusive, accessible and inclusive built environment. It came out in two parts. We covered the external environment, we covered buildings. And within that, there was a lot of the learning that came through from 2012 and subsequent work to look at how to mainstream inclusivity within the building design process. And this is really just, but this is looking about what we're looking to design. But it sets out, this is setting out its view of a strategy that starts off with a strategic vision. It goes from all the way through to development agreements, master plan and detailed design, but also into the post-occupancy evaluation. And within that, it starts to talk about the intersectionality that we started to try and address within the 2012 standards. So we do address age. We within the British standard we do address faith within that. We do address family within it. It's not looking specifically at disability. And I think in thinking about all of this over these years, I think it is quite clear that there is a focus on white, middle-aged, disabled men within that focus of where we were originally. Regulations really being designed and written, people looking a bit like me. So it's important to take that on board. But I think one of the things there is it doesn't then address. It still doesn't address who is designing, and I think that's the most important part. So, introduction to part 3 of my world is I have the privilege of being one of the Mayor of London's design advocates, and I sit on the Diversity Inclusion Sounding Board for the Good Growth programme that we sit within. And I take no credit for this publication, but I think it was able to contribute in a small manner to it. But this is a very important document for me, the Handbook on Supporting Diversity, and it asks this it makes this very important statement. So across a city of almost 9 million people, our built environment is something that is shared. We use it, move through it, and spend time in it every day. How it is designed and managed impacts all of us. Therefore, who is invited to design it and how is a profound question. I think a very profound question indeed, because I think in the reality is that actually it's London or the world is not being designed by the people who live there, who are representative of the people there. And I think which brings me back to the kind of first slide is an inclusive and attractive built environment that represents the communities that we serve. So the roadmap for change, one of the things that does set out is the lack of inclusive environment professionals can impact on attracting diversity within those organisations. Without the diversity within the organisations that are delivering the built environment, we will not achieve our industry vision. And I think it's not so all of the work that we've done around design standards, I think, is important. But what is more important for me is that we need to reflect and push forward in changing the diversity of the industry to actually deliver real change. Which brings me to the end of presentation, and I think we have got time now for any questions to come through. I don't see any questions coming through, but thank you very much for attending. I hope you found it useful, and look forward to hopefully carrying on the conversation with people in the future.